Well, let's bring in our panel now. Joining me live is former federal prosecutor Shan Wu and Republican analyst and political strategist Rina. A warm welcome to you both. Great to have you with us here on BBC News. I want to begin by asking you, we know there are a number of top Republicans repeatedly who have told Donald Trump that his claims of widespread voter fraud were false. Firstly, to you, Sean, how important do you think that will be, that there will be these Republican calls that we know in the past saying that this narrative was false? How important do you think that will be in proving intent?
Well, I think that as long as those public statements aren't making it into the courtroom, then that's not going to be much of an issue at all. Although, obviously, a big part of Trump's defense strategy is trying to argue that he lacked the right state of mind. He actually believed he won. And we've spent a lot of time analyzing that, looking at the circumstantial evidence for it. But a very critical prosecution strategy at this point has to be, they don't need to prove what he really believed. What they need to prove is he had the intent to do the illegal act, which were these specific actions named in the indictment, trying to change the results. So that ultimately, a little bit of a red herring to be pulled into the political and public argument of did he really believe that he lost or not. Legally, they need to shift that from a prosecution standpoint.
Well, Rina, despite the likes of Mike Pence, William Barr refuting this narrative that the election was stolen, still we are seeing a high level of support from Donald Trump's base. How do you explain that?
Well, that base is so behind this former president because they believe him to be a champion for their ideas. The idea that there is a deep state in D.C. and that there is an entire establishment cadre of politicians that is against them. And these are Americans who really epitomize this era that we live in of grievance politics. So this MAGA faction, the Make America Great Again faction of the Republican Party, is dwindling in size. And what we see as they get smaller is that they get more extreme. So they're coming out now saying that this is a witch hunt and that the former president is being unfairly prosecuted. But the more concerning part is that there are people who are sitting in elected positions on Capitol Hill saying almost the very same thing. Today, House Conference chair for the Republicans, Elise Stefanik, the congresswoman from New York, she put out a statement, and the last couple of lines of her statement, I'd like to read it because it's just so jarring to me. She said, President Trump had every right under the First Amendment to correctly raise concerns about election integrity in 2020. Now let that sink in. They're making this about election integrity. But then she goes on to say, despite the DOJ, our Department of Justice, despite their illegal attempt to interfere in the 2024 election on behalf of Joe Biden, President Trump continues to skyrocket in the polls and will defeat Biden and be sworn in as president of the United States in January 2025. I mean, when you've got elected officials that are carrying the water for you, you don't even need the bully pulpit every day. Trump is winning the messaging wars against his Republican opponents in the primary right now because he's coming out so powerfully screaming victim, which is completely antithetical to Republican ideas of the past at least 20 years.
Well, it's one thing for those messages to gain traction in the court of public opinion. What about in the court of law? Shan, do you think that would be seen as an adequate defense, that this is just about essentially First Amendment free speech rights?
It probably won't be, because the indictment was sort of prescient that way and took care to point out, yes, he has a First Amendment right, but a First Amendment is not a complete defense to any crime. We've been hearing this analogy about the idea of a robber walking into the bank, handing over a note that says, give me all your money, I have a gun. And then the analogy to Trump's defense would be that robber gets prosecuted and he says, oh, what, writing is now a crime? So it's quite obvious that they're clear about when you've done something illegal versus just expressing yourself on the First Amendment. Now, certainly do expect there'll be litigation about that. They'll probably raise that in a pretrial motion. There may be arguments legally before they even get to the jury verdict about that. But that's certainly going to be very much front and center as part of his defense, is this notion that it's just my First Amendment right to speak.
Well, despite these legal problems, weighing up for Donald Trump. We're still seeing him out in front when it comes to the Republican race. Rina, why do you think that is? Why do you think that Ron DeSantis, for example, or any other candidate for that matter, still can't close that gap?
Well, there is something to be said about how this Republican Party operates in this era as well. And what Governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, is doing is going very hard right on the social issues. And that's not sitting well with many people. Many people being those who are actually have become moderate or more center right, or even a little bit more independently minded in the era of Trump. I see people having run to sort of the extremes within the Republican Party. And now the people who really believe that they could fight for them, that there could be somebody who fights for them, don't see somebody within this pack of candidates who can do that. And so you do see these establishment types, these former governors, former ambassadors. These are people with long resumes in public service, and it's hard for them to raise money from small donors. And these are donors who are giving something between $1 and $10 per donation. In Trump's time in the White House, this was the prowess showed with the Republican Party, and none of his opponents in the primary so far, though we are very early out, have been able to do that very thing.
We've got about less than 30 seconds. Shan, what do you expect ultimately to come out of this trial? Very briefly, if you don't mind.
I think ultimately, if they can get it to trial in time, looks like he would be convicted. Seems like a very strong case. The time pressure is a big random factor. This one's more likely to get to trial before the red zone, the presidential election season. It's still very difficult, though. And if they push too hard, and if the judge pushes too hard, they create a possible reversal if there's a conviction, because the argument would be that the defense did not have enough time to prepare. So it's a very careful line that has to be walked.
All right, former federal prosecutor there, Shan Wu, and Republican analyst and political strategist, Rina Shah. A big thanks to you both. Thanks so much for joining us on BBC News. Sure.